All right, welcome to your last unit. This is Unit 8 Ecology, and I told you that I'd make this first lecture pretty quick. So here we go. We're going to start with this diagram that's here in your notes, and you're just going to annotate that diagram. So this is a diagram that shows us that life is really organized. Typically, we talk about that organization from small all the way up to large. And so some of this is what we've already discussed this year. We spend most of our year leading up to this stage right here. And we're getting ready to kind of zoom through the rest of the diagram here in Unit 8. So as a quick review, things that you have already learned, but you should add to your diagram: the atomic structure. So this labeling box right here, label this as the atomic structure or as atoms. And we know that atoms pull together to create molecules. And so here is a molecule. Looks like a water molecule. I'm not sure if it is, but that is a molecule. Molecules collected together help to form macromolecules, which eventually form organelles. And so that's what we're seeing right here at this level of organization, organelles. And organelles gather together to form cells. Cells are the smallest unit of life, the smallest thing on this diagram that we could consider living. Cells, multiple cell types that are supporting the same function, we call those tissues. Tissues pull together and create organs. Now, I know that sometimes we don't think about a bone being an organ, but actually it is. It is made of living tissue that is collectively serving a unified function. And then we gather organs together into an organ system, like this skeletal system here in the diagram. So all of those are sort of small things that we have learned about and that kind of build one on top of the next, on top of the next. This last unit picks up here with an individual and works its way around a couple of these levels as we kind of go throughout the unit. So what is new on this diagram, which is what you will label and what you will describe: the organismal level of life, or the individual level of life. That is a collection of organ systems create an organism, and then a collection of organisms or individuals give us a population. And so population is labeled on the diagram, but also needs to be defined. Populations are individuals that are of the same species. They live together in the same environment. And so a lot of times conversation around the population level of life is all about breeding. Because they're the same species, they can successfully interbreed. So we'll talk about things that contribute to population growth and what happens when your population grows or declines. Moving forward to this level right here, I'll leave my arrow here for a minute. This is the community. So community ecology is when we gather several different populations in an area, and we talk about the interactions between those different populations. Now, they're not going to interbreed, but they will interact. And we see a lot of things like predator-prey interactions at this level of life. Moving down, here is, if you look at these two pictures, they look really similar, except you can see mountains in the background of this one. So this is an ecosystem level. Ecosystems are all of the community stuff, which are living organisms, but it also introduces non-living factors like the mountains back here and the snow and the climate. So those are called abiotic factors. So an ecosystem is living and non-living components in an area sort of interacting with each other. If we move forward down here, this large portion of the diagram is all read together. These are essentially multiple ecosystems, right? So a biome is a larger region of the world and all of the ecosystems that exist within that region. And then ultimately we progress up here where we label the Earth, and this is a biosphere, and that is all of the biomes on Earth. So life progresses in an orderly fashion, typically. And so we see from small to large what that hierarchy of life really looks at. We're going to spend some time talking about populations. We're going to spend some time talking about communities, and we're going to spend some time talking about ecosystems here in this ecology unit. So let's start with kind of a guiding question here. How do individuals respond to their environment? So this would be a conversation that we could have related to community ecology and even to ecosystems as well. So there are a couple of ways that individuals respond to their environment. They're either going to respond behaviorally with their behaviors, or they're going to respond physiologically. So those are the two primary ways in which individuals respond to their environment. Let's talk behavior first. So let's go big and broad with the definition for what is behavior. It's an action or possibly a mannerism that is made by individuals in response to a stimulus. And that stimulus could be a sound, it could be something that you see, it could be a chemical that you're exposed to. So the stimulus can vary, and your action or mannerism to that stimulus is classified as a behavior. There are two broad categories of behavior. There are innate behaviors, and then there are also learned behaviors. So let's check out the innate behavior video before we see the words pop up on the screen. We have to know the difference between innate behaviors and learned behaviors. And then we also have to know some examples. So the video that you're getting ready to see, those examples will be listed in the next section of your notes on the next slide. So pay attention not just to what the definition of an innate behavior is, but some of these examples that we're going to see in the video.
Innate behavior is behavior that you are born with, behavior which you inherit because it is in your DNA. It is instinctive behavior. For example, a spider knows how to spin a web as soon as it is born, or a baby can suckle, because it is instinctive. The behavior is intrinsic, which means it will be present even if an animal is raised on its own, without parents or others of its species to teach it. It is also stereotypical, which means the behavior will be performed the same way each time. Innate behavior is thought to be inherited through genes, and it can't be changed by the individual. It is inflexible. It can be very complex, and it does not have to be learned. It will be fully developed from birth. Innate behavior is beneficial, and because it is encoded in DNA, it is subject to natural selection. This means that over time, the genes that cause the best behavior will become more common among the individuals of a species. A reflex is an example of innate behavior, like when you automatically pull away your hand from something that is hot. You don't have to think about it. You didn't have to learn to do it. As a human, it's just something that you do. A scientist named Lagerspetz tried to prove that innate behavior has a genetic base by selecting very aggressive mice and breeding them together. Aggressive mice would cross an electrified grid to attack an opponent, or would choose an opportunity to fight rather than remain peaceful. The results were compared to a control of mice with non-aggressive genetic lines. The results showed that a few genes affect variation in fighting behavior. When aggressive mice were bred together, aggressive offspring were produced. Winning enhanced fighting behavior of aggressive animals, but not of initially non-aggressive animals. However, it's difficult to find purely innate behavior because a lot of an animal's behavior is the result of an interaction between genes and the environment.
Which is a lovely cue into learned behavior here in just a second. So let's see if, there we go. So innate behavior is like the video talked about, it's instinctive behavior, behavior that you are born with, that is automatic and it is consistent. It doesn't change, and it's based in your genome. And so because it is based in your genome, it is susceptible to natural selection, because genes, alleles, can increase or decrease in a population. And if those alleles code for an innate behavior that is beneficial, we would expect to see those genes increase in the population. If it codes for a behavior that is not beneficial, we would see those decline in the population. The other kind of behavior is learned behavior. So learned behavior is a little more typical of kind of what we think of as behavior. So let's check a portion of this out.
Learned behavior is based on experience. It is acquired only through observation, so it wouldn't be present in animals raised alone, without others of their species to observe, and it isn't coded in DNA. Individuals learn a behavior if they have previously gained a benefit from the behavior, and a learned behavior can be improved and refined through practice. When you hear the school bell ring and you go to your lesson, you are performing a learned behavior. When you hear the bell, you know it signals that it's time to go to your next class because you have learned to do it by repeating the same action in response to the stimulus, so you won't get in trouble. Learned behavior is different throughout the population and is affected by the environment. For example, a dolphin can learn to perform and jump through a hoop. This behavior has been affected by the dolphin's environment. It is being taught by a trainer, and it knows that if it jumps through the hoop, it will receive a reward. A wild dolphin wouldn't necessarily know to jump through a hoop if presented with one. Learned behavior has 5 characteristics. It is non-inheritable, so it isn't passed on from previous generations. It is only acquired through observation or experience. 2. It is not intrinsic, so absent in animals raised in isolation from others. 3. It is permutable. This means that the pattern or sequence may change. The order of things might swap around. 4. It is adaptable, so it can be changed to suit conditions. And 5. It is progressive, so it can be performed and refined through practice. Habituation is a type of learned behavior. If an individual is repeatedly exposed to a stimulus, the response decreases and the individual becomes habituated. In other words, you get used to it and you learn to ignore the stimulus. This can happen when wild animals continually come into contact with humans. Over time, their frightened flight response will decrease. This process is called habituation. Imprinting is another type of learned behavior, where a very young animal fixes its attention on the first thing it hears, sees, or touches. The animal then follows the object around, which is usually its parent. So, to recap, learned behavior is not inherited. It is not intrinsic, so it wouldn't be present in animals raised in isolation. It may change over time and adapt or improve, and sequences might change. Learned behavior is learned from other individuals, the opposite of innate behavior.
Okay, so, let's pause that. Boop, there we go. So we saw learned behavior can develop over a lifetime of an individual. It can change based on experiences. It's variable, it's flexible. It is not something that we are born with. It is not connected to our DNA. And we can learn it. We can learn behaviors from others. It's really the basis for the majority of our behaviors, especially when it comes to anything that we are training for, towards, or against. Even things like walking and eating, holding a spoon. We were trained, that's a learned behavior process, to be able to do that. Now, moving forward, oh my goodness, all the videos are going to try to play. Here are some examples, some from the video, and then a few from things that we've seen before in class. So a great example of a behavioral response And this is a broad behavioral response, is called taxis and kinesis. We talked about this when we did our isopod lab, our roly-poly lab. Taxis and kinesis is the rate of movement towards or away from a stimulus. And that is an innate. Taxis and kinesis are behavioral responses that are innate. They don't have to be trained. They exist from the moment of birth. Migrations, birds migrate. We also have land animals that migrate, like elephants. We have sea animals that migrate. So migrations happen for various reasons, typically following a food source or getting into a climate that is warm enough to sustain kind of a winter season. That's an innate behavior. Knowing where to go in migration is innate. It is not trained. It is not, they might fly, the birds might fly together, but if you had them, if you could run an experiment and let them fly individually, they would all still end up in the same place. Tropisms are behaviors that plants express. And so you have a picture in your notes over here of 4 different kinds of plant tropisms. So phototropism is a plant's behavioral response to light. Plants will grow towards a light source. If you have any indoor plants in your home, go look at them. The leaves are probably directed towards the light source. Geotropism over here is a plant's behavioral response to gravity. It's an attempt to grow roots into the ground, to grow them down into the ground, because that's where soil and nutrients will be, and to grow the photosynthetic part and the flowering part, which is the reproductive structure aspect, up, so that it is available, visible, it can capture sunlight, insects and pollinators can access it. Thigmotropism is a plant's response to touch. And so a lot of plants will behaviorally respond to touching something by crawling around it. So think of vines crawl around objects that they encounter. And hydrotropism is a plant's response to water, and that is growing its roots towards a water source. So all of these are behavioral responses of the plant that are going to improve their chances of success and survival. Imprinting is another one that the video talked about. Imprinting is a learned behavior. So here's a great picture that illustrates imprinting. In the first couple of days, when a chick or a bird or an animal that imprints is born, they will attach to the first thing that they see in those couple of days and associate them with a caregiver and follow them around all over. And then, of course, training, which is a learned response or a learned behavior. The kind of buzzword in training is conditional training. That was, if you've ever heard of Pavlov and his dog experiment, that's a conditioned response. He trained a dog to salivate, to drool at a bell. And this picture shows sort of the start of his experiment and how he worked it. So he first introduced a dog to food, and the dog's natural response was to salivate or drool. Then he took the food away, came back a different time, rang a bell, and noticed the dog does not drool. So his whole experiment is, can I get the dog to drool in the presence of just the bell alone? And so he worked through a conditioning process where he presented the dog with food and the bell at the same time. So every time he brought the food out, the dog naturally started to salivate. He rang a little bell. And eventually, over time, the dog learned that every time the bell rang, he seemed to get food. So guess what happens? Eventually, he rings the bell. Even though there's no food, the dog is anticipating the food. He has learned that the bell is associated with the food, and he eventually drools at just the bell alone. So that's a lot of the basis of training, which is, of course, learned behavior. Now, let's move into the last thing here that we're going to talk about in this slide deck. not behavioral responses, but now physiological responses. The second category that answers the question, how do individuals respond to their environment? They can respond physiologically. So what does this mean? A physiological response is usually something that's happening inside or on the surface of your body, and it's a response to a stimulus. So a great example of this is our fight or flight response. When we talk about physiological responses to our environment, in animals, in plants, it's a great example of cell communication because these are things happening inside of our body. This depends on cell communication at work inside of an organism. So this chemical signal right here, epinephrine, is a stimulus. Well, this is released in response to a stimulus. Maybe you see something, maybe you hear something, it makes you really nervous. This chemical gets released, and this chemical goes and binds to cells in these various organ systems to produce an internal physiological response that we call the fight or flight response. So let's write that down here for just a second, and then I'll come back to a second example of a physiological response that is not in a human. So fight or flight, it's triggered by a stimulus. Usually that's something that you see or something that you hear. So a visual or an auditory stimulus. It could be triggered by something that you feel, which would be a tactile stimulus. Because of that stimulus, your body releases epinephrine that acts on cells in various locations in your body to produce the response that we associate with fight or flight. So you get really nervous, think about your palms sweat, the hair on the back of your neck stands up, your pupils dilate, your heart rate increases, your breathing increases. All of those are a physiological response to an environmental stimulus. The example over here in the picture, which is also in your notes, I think is really, really, really cool. So this is an example of a plant that is responding to an herbivore destroying it. So you have this caterpillar here that is eating away at the edges of the leaf. And so you see kind of a step through pathway, but there's cell communication involved, and the ultimate response is so, so cool. And it is an example of how the plant responds to its environment. So when the caterpillar eats the leaves, that is wounding or breaking down some cells. Those cells release signals, and that signal transduction pathway triggers the release of chemicals from the plant itself. And those chemicals go out into the environment and they call in these little wasps that are parasites to this caterpillar. And so this is a defense mechanism. This is how the plant is responding to basically being destroyed by the caterpillar. It can't move. It is calling in something else that can move and infect this caterpillar and kill it. Or if the caterpillar is smart enough, it could learn, hey, this is a plant that has a response that could get me killed. So this is a very interesting thing that a plant, because of damage done by an insect, can release a chemical that calls in a different organism that can destroy that predator, essentially. All right, once you hit this section, we're going to cover this in class. Why do individuals respond? So you are done.